There were plenty of controversial yet talented strikers in the 90s, and Mark Viduka certainly fits the bill. Born in Melbourne, the big Aussie exploded onto the scene in the Australian National Soccer League as a teenager. Between age 18 and 20, Marco, as he was known at the time, scored 47 goals in 53 games for Melbourne, Croatia, later Melbourne Knights, drawing the attention of teams all around Europe. So popular a figure was he at the club, they'd later name a stand after him, as it was the transfer fee they earned for Viduka that paid for it. That fee came from the Croatian side now known as Dinamo Zagreb, who at the time were named Croatia Zagreb. He continued his goal-scoring form in the country where his dad had emigrated from to Australia. In 103 appearances for Zagreb, he managed 52 goals, including scoring an eye-catching 8 goals in 12 European appearances. Again, this form led to interest from bigger and richer sides around Europe. In November 1998, Celtic were struggling in the SPL behind league leaders Rangers. Club icon Henrik Larsson was in good form, but manager Joe Venglos felt the club needed a new striker. Harold Bratback, Simon Donnelly and Darren Jackson were all struggling for fitness and goals. Viduka had impressed against Celtic in Champions League qualifying just a few months previously. On November 20th, Celtic Managing Director Fergus McCann declared, "We have concluded arrangements for the transfer of Marko Viduka with a fee of £3 million agreed some time ago." Everything seemed to be primed and ready to go, and then things went very wrong. Just 4 days before he was due to arrive in Glasgow, Viduka claimed to be suffering from stress and depression and announced he was quitting the club before even moving to Scotland. Viduka would later say he was mentally and not in the right frame of mind to play football. Celtic offered medical counselling and to bring his parents from Australia, as well as giving him an extended Christmas break, but Marko rejected all these offers. He said he simply didn't want to play football and returned home to Melbourne. Fergus McCann threatened to sue Viduka, and the transfer saga rumbled on for a further 3 months. At a time when Celtic were locked in a title race with Rangers and trying to make up lost ground, this was the last thing the club needed. The lawsuit threat didn't go down too well with the Australian striker, who would later say, "Some people I know say Fergus is a very nice man once you get to know him. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, I suppose." Eventually, all issues seemed to be resolved, and Viduka would go on to make his debut against Dundee United in February of 1999. It was unfortunately too little too late in terms of helping Celtic win the title, but Viduka impressed in the latter stages of the season, scoring 8 goals in 11 games. In the summer of 1999, Celtic replaced Joe Venglos as manager with John Barnes. Mad to think now, but at the time, the appointment was met with a frenzy of excitement. The England and Liverpool legend was inheriting an impressive if underperforming squad, but one area of the starting 11 that certainly didn't need strengthening was the forward line. Henrik Larsson and Mark Viduka was as top quality a front pairing as the SPL has ever seen. The duo complemented each other brilliantly, with Larsson's pace in finishing paired alongside Viduka's strength in finishing. Scottish defences didn't have a chance up against them. Celtic scored 25 goals in their opening 8 league games, with 7 coming from Larsson and 9 coming from Viduka. Memorably, both players netted a hat-trick in an October 1999 7-0 win over Aberdeen. They were unstoppable. Then, the worst thing that could happen to Celtic happened. Henrik Larsson broke his leg in a UEFA Cup game against Lyon in late October and was ruled out for the rest of the season. Nobody could replace Henrik, and the team suffered greatly in his absence. However, Viduka kept up his free-scoring form in Larsson's absence. Unfortunately, John Barnes was unable to provide a decent replacement to pair with Viduka up top. He moved to give his former England teammate Ian Wright a short-term contract at Parkhead. Wright was a quality player in his day, but he was 36 when he arrived in Glasgow. Mark Birchall was a young player coming through the ranks at Celtic with plenty of potential, but the end of the Larsson-Viduka front pairing was essentially the end of Celtic's season. The club went from one disaster to another throughout the course of the campaign. All hopes were pinned on Viduka to carry the team at this point, and it was simply too much to ask. John Barnes was an utterly clueless manager, and Viduka became increasingly aware of this as the season went on. Matters came to a head in the now infamous Scottish Cup game against lower league Inverness Caledonian Thistle in February 2000. 2-1 down at half-time, in the changing room, Viduka is said to have simply refused to go back out for the second half. the Aussie would reportedly toss his boots in the bin. As bad as things were, this was completely unacceptable. Despite all this, Viduka ended the season with 27 goals in 37 games, and even won the 2000 PFA Scotland Players Player of the Year award. This all sounds well and good, and in truth, Viduka does deserve praise for his efforts. However, it felt like he could have gave so much more. Celtic fans recognise what a talented player he was, but he was frequently accused of simply not giving his all. Viduka does reject this claim, saying, "I worked my arse off at Celtic. The club was in turmoil, but I was top scorer and player of the year. I really left my heart there. I refuse to accept it when someone says otherwise." In the summer of 2000, Martin O'Neill would be appointed as Celtic manager. Like the fans, the Irishman saw how incredibly talented Viduka was and desperately wanted to keep a hold of the Australian. However, Viduka wanted out. There was plenty of interest in the big striker, and it would be Premier League side Leeds who would claim his signature for a then record Celtic incoming fee of £6 million. O'Neill would end up using the money to sign Chris Sutton from Chelsea as a replacement for Viduka, who would go on to form an even better and more successful partnership with the returning Henrik Larsson than Viduka did, so it seemed to work out for everybody. Viduka arrived at Leeds and made an instant impact. His manager at Ellen Road was Irishman David O'Leary. Discussing his first impressions of the Aussie, O'Leary would say, "When I first met him, I told him he gave the impression of being a lazy so-and-so. He laughed and told me he had only had to play to 70% of his ability in Scottish football and still scored all the goals. But he said he now wanted to be pushed. I said I'd do that and warned him there would be times when he'd wondered what he'd let himself in for." But Viduka was never one to back down and came out to the press to reject ever having made such a remark. "I never had a conversation remotely like this with David. I don't know where these comments are supposed to have come from, but I certainly didn't say anything like that. I gave 150% every time I played for Celtic. If I hadn't, then I don't think I would have been top scorer or player of the year. If I'd gone into an Old Firm game playing at 70%, I would have came off on a stretcher. You can't go into any game like that, never mind a Glasgow derby. It just doesn't happen." Despite this brief war of words, Viduka settled in well in a Leeds team that was spending big money and filled with quality players at the time. As well as his compatriot Harry Kewell, the squad included Robbie Keane, Olivier Dacour, Jonathan Woodgate and Rio Ferdinand. In his first season at Ellen Road, Leeds finished in the top 4 and reached the semi-finals of the Champions League. Viduka himself was in excellent form, scoring 22 goals in 53 appearances. The high point of his campaign, and maybe even Viduka's career, came on the 4th of November 2000, when Viduka scored all 4 goals for Leeds in a classic 4-3 Premier League win over Liverpool. Viduka really showed what he was capable of on the day, and proved he could be the world-class player others so often said they saw in him. However, he could never really find the consistency to go with his talent. That summer, Viduka found himself linked with AC Milan, who were the club he supported as a boy growing up. Leeds, however, wanted £38 million for the striker, which Milan were not prepared to pay. Viduka was also linked with a move to Manchester United and claims to have held talks with Alex Ferguson over the switch, but ultimately he would remain at Ellen Road. In the summer of 2001, Viduka was one of the most sought after forwards in world football and looked destined to go to the very top of the game. The 2001-2002 campaign didn't go quite as well for Leeds. They slipped out of the top 4, finishing 5th, and financial meltdown was closing in on the club. Viduka did have another impressive season, scoring 16 goals in 42 appearances, but it was all downhill from here for Leeds United. In the 2002-03 season, the club's debts mounted, and they sold nearly all of their star players to balance the books, except Viduka. Gone were Rio Ferdinand, Robbie Keane, Lee Bowyer and Robbie Fowler. Viduka again found himself in a position where all hopes were pinned on him, and again it was simply too much to ask. Leeds found themselves in a relegation battle at the end of the season. However, Viduka did step up to score a late winner on the penultimate day of the season away to Arsenal that would secure their safety for another year. It was another strong showing from the Aussie as he scored 22 goals in 40 appearances. Inevitably, however, Leeds were relegated at the end of the 2003-2004 Premier League campaign. That relegation came in Viduka's final ever appearance for the club. He scored a penalty in a 4-1 loss to Bolton before being shown a red card just minutes later. Leeds manager at the time, Eddie Gray, said Viduka should be remembered not for that red card, but for scoring more than 20 goals a season in each of his first 3 Premier League campaigns. Viduka was still only 28 years old at this point, so once again there were plenty of teams interested in signing him. It would be Middlesbrough who would claim his signature in the summer of 2004 for a fee of £4.5 million. Steve McLaren's men came into the season on the back of a League Cup win the previous year, so had European football to look forward to. Viduka was once again linking up with a squad packed with talent, as well as fellow Australian internationals Mark Schwarzer and Brad Jones. Borough had Gareth Southgate, Gaizka Mendieta, Ray Parlour, Bodo Zenden and Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank amongst their ranks. Despite this, Viduka's first season at the club would be an injury-struck disappointment, managing just 7 goals in 21 appearances. However, Viduka would put this behind him the following year, as the 05-06 season was a memorable one for Middlesbrough fans. The club famously went on an amazing run in Europe, reaching the UEFA Cup final. In both the quarter and semi-finals, McLaren's side would overturn 3-goal deficits to advance, and Viduka was a crucial part of these comebacks. He scored a double against Basel in the quarter-finals and a vital goal against Steaua Bucharest in the semis, bringing his total to 6 goals in 9 games in Europe that season. However, the final would end in heartbreak, as Middlesbrough were hammered 4-0 by Sevilla. Viduka would say it took him 4 months to get over the devastation of this defeat. In total, Viduka scored 16 in 43 in all competitions that season, and followed that up by scoring 19 in 37 in the 06-07 campaign. His contract was up at the end of that season, and former teammate Jonathan Woodgate was now his manager, but couldn't convince Viduka to sign a new contract at the Riverside. Overall, Mark Viduka scored 42 goals in 101 appearances for Middlesbrough, and looks back fondly on his time at the club. My time at Middlesbrough was really enjoyable because I used to love coming into training every day. I liked being with those people. From Elaine the kit lady to the people that work in the canteen, I just used to love coming there because it was a very friendly club and the players got on really well together. Now aged 31, Big Sam Allardyce swept aside Viduka for Newcastle. Much was expected of Newcastle that year, with a squad containing Michael Owen, Obafemi Martins, Shay Given, Damien Duff and James Milner, but it was to be a huge letdown for the fans overall. Pretty much all their key players faced lengthy spells out with injury, Viduka included. In January, Big Sam was sacked and replaced with a returning Kevin Keegan. Things did improve in the second half of the season. Facing a relegation battle, they rallied to finish 12th, with Viduka managing 7 goals in 28 appearances. The following year was a disaster, and would prove to be the final season of Mark Viduka's career. He missed 6 months due to an Achilles injury, and none of the managers Newcastle tried throughout the season, from Kevin Keegan to Chris Hughton to Joe Kinnear to Alan Shearer, could prevent them from being relegated. Viduka made just 12 appearances, failing to score a single goal. At the age of just 33, Mark Viduka made the decision to retire from professional football. Released by Newcastle, he had the opportunity to continue his career back in his native Australia with Melbourne Heart in the newly formed A-League, and was also linked with a move to Fulham, but injuries and age had caught up with the once seemingly unstoppable striker. Despite a bit of a campaign to get him to come out of retirement a year later to join Australia's squad for the 2010 World Cup, his mind was made up. Which brings me to the one part of Viduka's career we haven't yet discussed, his international outings with the Aussie national team. Eligible for Croatia, Ukraine or Australia, it was the Socceroos who managed to tie him down, giving him his international debut, aged just 18, against South Africa. He would represent his country at the Olympics in 1996 and 2000, and the Confederations Cup in 1997. He would go on to thrive under the management of Guus Hiddink as Australia qualified for the 2006 World Cup. Viduka captained the side in all 3 group games as they progressed from a group that included Brazil, Japan and Croatia, securing 4 points. They were eventually knocked out in the round of 16 by Italy due to a 95th minute penalty from Francesco Totti. Viduka wound up his international career with the 2007 Asian Cup, which was the Aussies' first appearance in the competition. He scored a goal against Iraq and a double against Thailand, although Australia would be eliminated on penalties in the quarter-finals by Japan. In total, Viduka scored 11 goals in 43 appearances for his national team. A decent return, but it always felt like there could have been more. And in some ways, that sums up Mark Viduka's career. He was a superb player, a top quality striker in his prime, but it always felt like he was capable of slightly more. He frequently faced accusations of being lazy or not playing to his best, but when he really turned it on, Mark Viduka was amongst the best strikers in world football. Despite any criticisms, Viduka had a career he can be proud of. One of the best players Australia has ever produced, he himself produced the goods at high levels. Viduka now enjoys life away from football, owning a coffee shop in Zagreb. It's clear that at times a career at such a high level took a toll on Viduka, but he has plenty of memories to look back on fondly. There are so many moments. Everyone assumes scoring 4 goals against Liverpool would be my highlight, or captaining Australia at a World Cup. But I'd have to say, kicking the ball in the family backyard with my dad will always be my greatest football memory.